Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
Yes, we'll rally round the flag, boys, we'll rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. We will rally from the hillside, we'll gather from the plain, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah. Down with the traitor and up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom.
My guest today is Dr. Timothy Roberts. He is a graduate of the University of Oxford and an historian of 19th century American history. He has been a professor at Bilkent University in Ankara, Turkey, and currently serves as professor and graduate director at Western Illinois University. Dr. Roberts has been the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including a Fulbright Lecture Award to teach in China. He previously was awarded 2 Andrew Mellon Foundation Research Fellowships, 2 National Endowment for Humanities grants, and the Joan Nordell Visiting Fellowship from Harvard University's Houghton Library. Professor Roberts' research focuses on 19th century U.S. and Atlantic history. His first book, Distant Revolutions, 1848 and the Challenge to American Exceptionalism, was published in 2009. He has published multiple articles and book reviews for the American Historical Review, Diplomatic History, among others. His newest book, The Infernal War, The Civil War Letters of William and Jane Standard, published in 2018, provides a fascinating insight into how an Illinois couple dealt with the tumultuous Civil War, and it will be our topic of discussion today. Welcome, Dr. Roberts.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, no problem at all. Before we get into the subject matter, I have a question about the documents themselves. How rare is it to find Civil War era letters, and so many in such good condition that are legible and usable?
Yeah, this is really quite unique at this point to find this kind of large collection of legible, relatively intact letters exchanged between a Civil War soldier and his wife. At this point, there's been so much research on the Civil War, as everybody knows. So for this kind of collection to see the light of day right now is kind of highly unusual. The backstory a little bit is that the family of the descendants of William and Jane Standard, who are the writers in the book, had attempted to have the letters published back in the 1930s. The granddaughter of the Civil War couple wrote to several publishers, showed them a sample of letters, but uniformly the publishers or agents said that it's not really Civil War history. There isn't enough drama, and so kind of fortunately for our generation, these letters remained unpublished till today. It does show us a sense of how interest in the Civil War changes over time. Obviously, there's lots of interest in this kind of social history of the war, the effect of the war on a marriage, on a family in Illinois, on the Great Plains. So it is unusual, and I leapt at the chance to work with them once I was approached by the man in Atlanta, Georgia, Ron Currens, who had inherited his letters from his mother.
Well, Dr. Roberts, it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today we have Shock Top Belgian White from Anheuser-Busch. Now, Shock Top was not its original name. It was originally called Spring Heat Spiced Wheat, a spring seasonal beer. It was brewed in Fort Collins, Colorado in 2006. Now, the beer began as an on-tap only serving, and as the brand grew in popularity, it was bottled and became a year-round offering in 2007 and later renamed Shock Top. But back to Spring Heat for just a second. Spring Heat Spiced Wheat made a name for itself in the North American Beer Awards, where it took gold and bronze medal in the Belgian White category in 2006 and 2007, respectively. Today, though, Shock Top is a national brand for Anheuser-Busch with many different varieties, including some special limited edition brews that can be sampled at beer festivals across the country. Remember, the best way to enjoy the podcast is with one of our featured brews. And this is also my chance to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. Simply hit the subscribe button on the directory that you use to get new material right away after it is released. And to the ever-growing list of listeners from 40 countries and hundreds of cities across the United States, I raise my citrus-infused Shock Top Belgian White and say cheers. Let's start with the couple and their correspondence, which forms the basis of the book. Could you provide some background? Most people probably have not heard of William and Jane Standard, so who are they?
They are a couple who, at one level, are unusual in terms of how we think about the American Civil War as Northerners who were loyal to the Union cause versus Southerners who opposed the Union. This kind of book complicates that story in the sense that while the Standards are Illinoisans, in the so-called land of Lincoln, they're not terribly good patriots. On the other hand, if anybody is familiar with Illinois history, their political sentiments, their cultural attitudes are not entirely surprising. Early history of the state of Illinois was a pattern of settlement, especially in areas in the central part of the state and areas south and west, say places near and south of Springfield, the state capital, largely populated by people from the South, people coming from Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, even the Carolinas. And those people brought Southern attitudes with them. There was, in fact, a debate in Illinois in its first decades about whether Illinois would be open to slavery. So William and Jane Standard are from this kind of Southern background. Jane was born in Illinois, although her father came from Tennessee. William Standard, her husband, was from North Carolina. So they are Southerners living in Illinois, fairly well-to-do people. They do come out, they settle on land, they clear it, they're farming. They do own real estate at the time the Civil War begins. So they are kind of these yeoman farmers that we hear about in this era. People coming out to the frontier, settling, driving off people like Native Americans who are interfering with, could interfere with this ambition to settle and to create economic independence, to carve your own way. And they are typical of that pattern. So on one level, this kind of couple is surprising. On the other hand, they're really typical of the kind of early settlers of pioneer Illinois.
So you mentioned the migration patterns in Illinois and how that, obviously that's going to impact Illinois politics. But I got a question specifically about those Southerners that were coming in. We're in central Illinois, so there was kind of a mix.
Mm-hmm.
In Quincy, John Wood, the founder's from New York, Orville Browning's from Kentucky. So you kind of have a mix. How about the individuals from the South who brought slaves with them? Now, Illinois is a free state. I think there's a misconception that it was very simplistic in that way. It was way more complex. So what happened to those individuals who brought, former slaves with them?
Right. So it's you scratch the surface in history and you learn that the reality is a lot more complicated than we maybe assume. Illinois, part of the previous old Northwest Territory, which had banned slavery. But then, as I said, partly because of the Southern Southerners who come to Illinois settle here, partly also because Illinois had been part of French Louisiana, where there had been slavery. So there is kind of residual support, I guess, or openness to slavery coming to Illinois. But Illinois' original Constitution, 1818, does ban slavery. On the other hand, it allows for indentured servitude. And I guess one way to view that is kind of temporary form of slavery. Generally, indentured servitude in Illinois meant white people coercing people of color, into labor. But this kind of coerced labor was not perpetual, like we know that slavery was as practiced in say the South. There were again periodic debates to change the Constitution of Illinois when there were constitutional conventions. There were debates about whether to legalize it, but those didn't pass. The main support for slavery in Illinois is in the southern part of the state, and in fact, there was legal slavery for a short period of time in the very tip of southern Illinois, in an area known as Little Egypt, where there were slaves used for mining. This book, I think, complicates the narrative about Illinois being a free state. Very harsh laws. I think we can probably get, it's probably related, is the passage of what were known as black codes in Illinois. Very harsh, basically anti-black laws that largely prohibited people of color from living in Illinois. If you were a person of color, you had to have a certificate of freedom on your person when you were traveling to show that you were not a fugitive slave. Very harsh laws in Illinois prosecuting people for helping fugitive slaves escape. Nonetheless, brave individuals, people like Richard Ells and Quincy, with whom I'm sure you're familiar, other white people of color, even in western Illinois, southern Illinois, were active in Illinois' Underground Railroad. So that is a kind of a long answer to the question of slavery, and you might call unfree labor in Illinois early in its history before the Civil War.
We live right on the Mississippi River here. And, Macomb's not too far from us either. But right across the river is Missouri. And there's little towns very similar to the little towns in Illinois that are scattered throughout Missouri. The thing that I always found interesting is you go into some of these little towns, say Louisiana, Missouri, for example, not too far from Pittsfield. There's a black population. You go to the same small or similar towns in Illinois, and there are no black populations at all, or hardly any residents in the history of the entire village. What's the reason for the lack of black residents? Does it go back to that very restrictive black code in Illinois?
I think that certainly has something to do with it. If you look at the U.S. Census, decade after decade, there just aren't very many people of color in Illinois until, largely the Great Migration during World War I. And then generally then it was, African Americans moving from the South to urban areas, especially Chicago, which had its own stories of racial violence, the Chicago race riot of 1919, the most notorious. Yeah, the black codes that basically prohibited black settlement in Illinois through the 1860s, finally abolished in 1865. I think even after the Civil War, there was hostility to African Americans coming to, especially to rural areas, like you said, villages and towns in downstate Illinois. There was, of course, heavier black population in areas East St. Louis proper, Chicago, Peoria, more urban areas, of course, Urbana-Champaign. Again, in some ways, it's the reason I think this book is interesting is because it shows how complicated the politics of a place like Illinois were and continue to be in terms of a northern state that exhibits the kind of conservative attitudes, conservative politics that in many ways mimic those of, what we associate with the Deep South. We talk about the history of the Underground Railroad in Illinois. That is obviously something to be to be proclaimed. And I think communities that can prove there are, forebears in the community who are active in the Underground Railroad, no doubt should take great pride in that. I think there also needs to be a reckoning in people who study Illinois history about how much resistance there was to people who believed that slavery was wrong, who believed that even, morally, despite the law, they were morally bound to help people achieve their freedom. The reason the Underground Railroad was so controversial was because it was not only illegal, it was highly unpopular. And there were as many, obviously lots of communities that absolutely condemned helping fugitive slaves, who condemned people trying to argue for the civil rights of people of color. And that is something that I think is reflected in the politics on the home front and the politics of the Army that you get from the letters between William and Jane.
Yeah, and I'd like to get back to them. And I believe they were in Lewiston, which isn't too far from here. They must have heard about, say, the Mission Institute in Quincy or the Underground Railroad in Jacksonville and Springfield. What was that sentiment towards abolition in a place like Lewiston?
Very hostile. I think Fulton County, as you said, is a little bit west of Springfield, moving towards the Missouri border. Springfield's kind of the boundary between people who come from New England and settle in the northern part of the state, and then everything south and west is, at least in the beginning, heavily populated by people from the American South. So Fulton County is a mix. It has obviously people who support the Union very ardently. Abraham Lincoln will come to Lewiston, come to Fulton County and speak, and newspaper reports talk about the great crowds come out and greet him. Lots of local officials salute Lincoln, support the Republican cause both before and during the war. But there's also people like the Standards who are skeptical of this high-powered, very progressive visionary for how the United States could become more open to everybody. I think Lincoln is not a flaming abolitionist himself, but he is, we would call him a liberal or a progressive. When you look at his speeches and then you look at his letters, I think Lincoln really did believe that irrespective of, your skin color, everybody deserved a chance of freedom and of economic opportunity. I think we kind of take these things for granted today, but for conservatives like the Standards, kind of white pioneers who had moved to this part of the country to be left alone, to have neighbors who were pretty much like themselves, this was a man and a cause who were very troubling. At times after he's left in the war, William, the soldier, will write back home to Jane, and he will say, I told you before the war that Lincoln was an abolitionist in hiding, and now his true identity has been revealed. So you get the sense that they were suspicious of Lincoln before the war, and their suspicions are vindicated, especially after January 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation really changes the war, broadens it to be not only a war against secession, but also a war to destroy slavery and to really fundamentally change the United States in ways the Standards were not very comfortable with.
The Standards, and you had mentioned this, are conservatives. Now, there's a misconception for students of, say, the 19th century. They have a different belief in what conservative means. If you use it in today's situation or with today's philosophy, it doesn't make any real sense. What does it mean to be a conservative and during that time towards slavery?
That's a good, I think, clarifier. I use the word conservative just to convey the sense that for somebody who believes that any kind of political, economic, social change should happen gradually, certainly in the 19th century when religious belief was widespread, America was largely still a kind of more or less Christian culture. If human society was going to change, then it should be left to God's providence to have that change happen, and that people should not kind of grasp after great authority and insist on change overnight. There is an aspect of conservatism in the 19th century, I guess, in a way that connects with 20th century, 21st century conservatism in resistance to big government. The standards, were not comfortable, especially with this kind of liberal kind of agenda that the Lincoln administration comes to embrace. Obviously, the war is an extenuating circumstance, and so, it would be interesting, though impossible to know how they would have felt about Lincoln in peacetime, because he was only a wartime president. But certainly, the Emancipation Proclamation, the executive power exercised to abolish slavery, also the way the Lincoln administration declared martial law throughout much of the North, basically suspending the courts, suspending civil liberties, was absolutely, anathema to people who believe the government people should be left alone, and government authority should be at the local level. So this is kind of how I talk about the standards as conservatives. I think especially from the religious point of view, there's certainly a 19th century element to it, but I think in some ways their attitudes about the role of government in human relations there's a kind of modern aspect to it as well.
So in these letters, it's correspondence between a husband and a wife. It's interesting to me how often politics comes up. Of those letters, is there a theme that generally comes up? Is it anti-war sentiment, anti-abolitionist sentiment? What's these themes, and what's the reasoning for so much of a political discourse between the two?
That's, I think, something that makes these letters unique. Lots of Civil War letter collections, you don't have the exchange between the soldier and his spouse. It's generally, a lot of times it's just one way. You get the letters of the soldier. You don't get the other side of it. So there is this kind of conversation that happens in the book between William and Jane, sometimes between William and his children. They had 3 children during the war, all at home under the roof with, Jane trying to keep the family going. You get the sense, I think, that Jane is a quick learner, and she begins to take an interest in politics once the war begins. By the end of the book, by the end of the war, she's commenting on political parties, on political issues more frequently than she was at the beginning. You get the sense that she has educated herself, reading the newspapers, especially reading local newspapers that were, what I kind of argue with represent this kind of copperhead anti-war perspective among certain Northern Democrats during the war. William, who had held political office before the war, he was a county sheriff, was more, and I think he was probably more educated than Jane. He had also taught school. So he had a kind of political bent probably before the war that he carried into it. And certainly his writing, his discussion of politics reflects how the politics of the home front are carried into the Army, the Union Army. And the politics those politics are part of what soldiers carry with them, even as they go, into the Deep South. The 1864 election, a critical election, there's real drama about whether President Lincoln will be reelected. Of course, we pretty much believe that if he had been defeated by the Democratic candidate, George McClellan, the war would have had a very different outcome. It's possible that the Emancipation Proclamation would have been rescinded. Probably there would have been a much quicker end of the war. I think that there's an exchange of political ideas. It's certainly not the kind of political ideas that we think about when we talk about good Yankees and patriots in the North supporting the cause. Jane and William are very hostile. They lament that William enlisted, and then they condemn Lincoln. They condemn Republicans. Certainly, they condemn the war being extended in their belief to ensure the liberation of slaves. They don't believe that the blood of white men should be spilled to free the black man. They use very racist language at times, which will shock again anybody who expects a Northern couple to come across as a modern express a modern kind of sentiment. It reminds us of the complicated Northern society that fought this war, and I think it challenges books about Civil War Northerners who really did embrace the liberal cause of anti-slavery, embrace the cause of civil rights for everybody. And we really have to account for people like the Standards who don't really fit that model.
Well, back to William Standard, since you brought it up, he doesn't have a positive view of Lincoln or the war. So why does William Standard, and many like him, enlist in the Army if he opposes the war?
Yeah, right off the bat, that is one of the more baffling issues. I am quite sure I have theories that I talk about why he enlists. He enlists in the fall of 1862 after there has been the first large engagements of Illinois soldiers that previous spring in Tennessee at the Battle of Shiloh, in which a large number of Illinois soldiers were killed, and you begin to get casualty reports in the North that are just shocking. Of course, the first battles of the Civil War would pale in comparison to the size of battles later in the war. So that's one reason that his enlistment is surprising that fall. It's also surprising that he enlists, given his age. He's 40 years old when he enlists. The average age of people who enlisted in the Civil War on both sides was probably in their mid-20s. He had a family. So there are lots of kind of factors that make it surprising he enlisted. I posit that he took his personal reputation very seriously, and his honor was what people thought of him was important to him, and so to not enlist when others were, he was concerned that may have been perceived as shirking his duty. I think perhaps less heroically. I think that I found evidence that he was a defendant in several lawsuits on the eve of the Civil War. As I said, he had been sheriff before the war, and looking at local judicial records here in Western Illinois, we find that he was a defendant in several lawsuits over apparently not collecting property or collecting money and then not giving it to the court to be provided to the person to whom that money or that property was owed. He may have had debts of his own. There were some real estate and so some real economic roller coasters in the late 1850s, and he may have been caught vulnerable, having speculated in the land in some land deals. So he may have had some economic pressure. Illinois was one of the states that suspended judicial proceedings against somebody if they were in the military, and so he did get relief from being dragged into court once he became a soldier. And so that was kind of much more kind of pragmatic motivation for him to join up. When I teach military history at my university, I ask students, and some of them are in the military, or they're in ROTC, they're in the National Guard. I ask them why they joined. And it's always kind of a mix of reasons. And I think that the reason that William joined is a very human, kind of complex set of factors. Nobody really essentially does anything. We always have mixed motivations. Some of them are noble, some are less so. And, there's a real kind of earthy aspect to learning possibly why William enlisted, why, understandably, and how Jane probably didn't want him to sign up. And so I speculate about why he does it, but I think at the end of the day, I leave it to the readers to decide about that question.
Back to the letters a little bit about that perception of either free blacks or slaves. How often does that come up? And I know it's uncomfortable probably for the reader to come across some of that language, but how often does it come up in their correspondence?
I wouldn't say it's in every letter. Generally, it seems to me like it's when either Jane or William has a reason to talk about Abraham Lincoln. There is a reference made to black people, and they at those times they use the N-word pretty frequently. It's a very coarse language. You get the sense that especially William blames black people for the war continuing. He cannot understand President Lincoln's insistence that the war be about ending slavery. And so slaves and I think probably people of color generally, if you asked him, along with President Lincoln, are these kind of dual nemesis of somebody like William Standard, a man who, coming from, frankly, a lot of people moved, a lot of fellows came to Illinois early on coming from the South to get away from slavery, to get away from people of color who represented the wealth of white Southern planters who had denied economic opportunity to people in the East who could not make it, so they came west. People like the Standards, people like Abraham Lincoln's father, a Southerner who brings his family west. I think there's references to black people that's scattered throughout the letters on both sides. Jane herself engages in it. And sometimes, she's a very complicated woman, I think. She taunts William about why he joined the military, given as it's being revealed that the Union Army is, the purpose is becoming to end slavery. So it's really a bitter pill for the Standards to be committed to what becomes the Union cause. At the end of the book, I do commend William because there is a lot of discussion. He and his wife, Jane, talk a lot about him deserting at times. I think at the end, I salute William for not deserting, for doing his duty. And I think that kind of what I call him a reluctant abolitionist, a guy who follows orders and becomes part of this United States military force that will destroy, slavery in the South, whether soldiers like William want to or not. The Union military brings him into its fold, and he becomes part of this army of liberation. Again, it's very complicated, and there were times in the book where he is really teetering, and he's being basically enticed by his wife. Sometimes Jane gives him ideas on how to desert, how to come back, and he is really tempted to just kind of sneak off and head back and take his chances. I think the fact that the war becomes a war against slavery is really part of that animus that William and Jane talk about.
Regarding his service, he's with the 103rd Illinois. Where did they actually serve? I know, as you mentioned, he doesn't enlist until 1862, and that's after Shiloh. Many Illinois units, including many in Western Illinois, fought at Shiloh. Where does the 103rd, where do they fit into the Western theater of the war?
Yeah, so the Illinois 103rd Regiment, and so a regiment is technically about 1,000 soldiers, but probably a little bit less in the Civil War, all from Fulton County. They are pretty much serving throughout the Civil War as part of the Army of the Tennessee. Lots of Union armies were named after rivers. In the east, the great force was the Army of the Potomac. In the west, it's the Army of the Tennessee. That was the army that the 103rd served in. William, as I said, he enlists in August of 1862. He is trained in Illinois for the rest of the fall of 62 before he travels by train to Camp Bolivar, Tennessee. Civil War, and it's interesting from the perspective of the impact of the railroad, but he talks a lot about how often he and his comrades traveled by railroad. The Civil War is not the first war, but it is probably the first war in world history in which lots and lots of soldiers travel on both sides via railroads. And in fact, one of the things that William will have to do in the beginning of his service is to guard railroad lines in Mississippi and Tennessee. So he is part of the effort, the first service for the 103rd in the campaign for Vicksburg, Mississippi, although he does not really see combat at that time. As I said, the Illinois 103rd will be a support unit that will guard Union supplies, largely do duty protecting Union railroad lines from Confederate saboteurs, Confederate bushwhackers who, will sabotage lines, take pot shots at Union soldiers and so forth. This is very tedious work, and this is when he's most often writing about deserting, is when he's, stationary and having to do this kind of tedious work day after day. He finally begins to take part in offensive operations in the fall of 1863. The 103rd is part of the campaign to relieve Union forces in Tennessee. They turn around from Vicksburg and they march northeast towards Tennessee. He will see his first real combat, William, and the 103rd will in November of 63 at Missionary Ridge. And there is a pause in his letter writing to Jane at that time for probably the longest pause during the war. And it may very well be because either letters are lost or he was traumatized from what he had witnessed at Missionary Ridge. And he'll occasionally make references later in the war to what had happened at Missionary Ridge. And you really get the sense that he had really been shaken up by his first experience of combat at that time. The 103rd then goes on to join William Sherman, and in the Atlanta campaign in the spring of 1864, there's very vivid letters that William writes about combat almost daily in the Atlanta campaign and in the battle for Atlanta itself in June and July of 64. Once Atlanta falls, and again, that's really a critical battle in the war itself, because it pretty much ensures that Lincoln will be reelected in November. After Atlanta falls, William will, continuing with the 103rd, is part of the Savannah campaign, the fabled March to the Sea, and he provides very vivid description of what's left of the Deep South as the army slowly makes its way from central Georgia to the Atlantic Ocean. Once they capture Savannah, they turn north. Sherman does, and when the war ends, William and the 103rd are in North Carolina when news arrives of Robert E. Lee surrender to U.S. Grant at Appomattox. Riveting description of William renders here, even though he has been very much a kind of caustic, cynical writer. he gives a sense of the elation and the celebrations that break out once the news spreads of that Lee has surrendered and the war pretty much is over by that point. So yeah, the Illinois 103rd really is at the forefront of a lot of big Civil War battles. Of course, you get it from the perspective of somebody on the ground, and you get a sense of what it was like to be a Union soldier, both doing the kind of tedious duty that often military service is, but also engaged in the kind of offensive warfare that really, certainly Western soldiers believed that they won the war. And that was, you get a sense of the critical kind of offensive strategies that Sherman adopted to take the war into the Deep South and to bring the heart of the Confederacy to its knees in order to win the war.
So William considers going AWOL or leaving the Army. As the war progresses and the Union Army experiences more success, does that desire to leave the Army or negativity towards the Army or towards President Lincoln or slavery itself, does that dissipate at all?
I argue that it really doesn't until the very end, and even then only momentarily. The one general that Standard writes about favorably is William Sherman. You get a glimpse of Sherman from a distance. Standard never meets him, but he does talk about Sherman, his impact on the troops, and the way that somebody like Sherman plays this critical role, I think, in the Union cause is to inspire reluctant soldiers like Standard not to quit and to believe in the Union cause despite, the out of control Lincoln administration, despite the incompetence of other Union commanders, despite the chronic problems of getting, paid by the paymaster, despite the bad food, despite the horrendous conditions of Union hospitals. William writes very graphically about how bad it is in Union hospitals where infections are out of control and, soldiers go to hospitals to die, basically. So there's all these negative things that William writes about in his experience. But, nonetheless, Sherman is the guy that I believe knows how to win this war. And you get a sense that it's like these crucial individuals in the Union, in the Union command structure that compel people like Standard to hang in there. So there is that. William, as I said, ends the war in North Carolina. He will then participate in the so-called Grand Review when the entire U.S. Army marches through Washington, D.C. in May of 1865. William describes, he's writing to Jane, he describes what it's like in Washington. He says, everybody is out cheering us. Young and old, black and white, wealthy and poor, everybody is out saluting us. And you get a sense that he is surprised and really impressed by this universal support. He really believes, I think, only then that he is being thanked for what he is committed to do. And that's the first time I observe that he doesn't use a racial epithet to talk about people of color. So there is this moment when he does embrace the Union cause that the official Union cause. The letters do end because he goes back home. He is honorably discharged in June of 1865. He makes his way back to Fulton County and he settles there for the rest of his life. And the letters end. So we don't know what his attitudes about, race relations or the post-war United States were. You can kind of piece some things together from circumstantial evidence. But I suspect his social views probably didn't change very much. Certainly Fulton County remained politically like it had been before the war. If you look at political outcomes, even just as one marker, Fulton County remained a Democratic state, that is to say, a county against the Republican Party pretty much until the 20th century. If you look at census records, very few black people in Fulton County, even after the Civil War. And so, I think the Civil War does change a lot of America in places like where the Standards lived for the rest of their days after the war. It may have more or less been, status quo.
So we talked a lot about William, his service, his philosophy towards the Army, and maybe towards the country. But we didn't mention very much about Jane. How, in these letters, do you see a maturation in her, a change in her because of the war and because of William's service?
She is very vulnerable at the beginning of the war. You get the sense she's hysterical when it hits her that even though William is not even too far away, she cannot see him regularly. He's now in the Army. And especially once he moves away out of state, she really, I think, falls apart. She writes him, said, "I cannot live without you another day. You must come home to see me. I cannot do this by myself." I think that they pretty much divided responsibilities before the war. He took care of their land holdings, transacting business, earning money. She was a homemaker. And for him to leave and to devolve all these responsibilities onto her alone really was overwhelming at the beginning. As I said, they also had 3 children. They had an infant daughter die right before the war. They mention her. So there is that kind of the burden of the tragedy of the loss of a child right before the war starts. Apparently, William did not tell Jane that he was having credit problems before the war. You get the sense that he just kind of skedaddles and says, what she doesn't know won't hurt her. And, but it does hurt her. And she really blasts him letters saying, "Why didn't you tell me we had all these problems before you left? I don't know what to do." And so beginning of the war, she's asking him, she's really letting him have it. Also asking him lots of questions about how to go to a bank, how to talk to somebody to borrow money. Slowly, those kinds of dire letters, the sense that she's, she can't handle it, they become less frequent. And you really get the sense that she becomes more self-confident. She grows accustomed to being alone. She doesn't like it, but she grows in, a sense that she's competent. She knows how to handle creditors. She takes in boarders in her own house. At one point, she accidentally allows somebody to come in as a tenant who is what she calls a black Republican, and somebody who isn't at all like she and her husband are politically. But she handles it. She says, "He's going to pay the rent, and I'm going to take his money." That's just how it is. So you get from her letters a sense of the political division within the county. As I said, she grows in political awareness. I think she also grows in self-confidence and self-assertiveness. At the end of the war, she is contemplating taking a job in a factory, a textile factory that somebody's starting up, which is, I think, a marker of her sense of economic independence as a result. I think her story is probably like those stories that historians have been telling lately about the impact of the wars, not just the Civil War, but on many American wars, on American women, and how there's hardship, but there's also opportunity for making money, to become more assertive in the home. And I think that is a very important element of this story. It's a story about the Civil War, but it's also a story about what it's like on the home front in a marriage in which the two people are separated, and how, in this case, the wife has to make do and become very resourceful.
The last question I have is actually something you touched upon. A lot of times we look at history through the experience of, say, a political party, and political parties change significantly from the time period we're discussing now to modern times. But a lot of times the people don't. You mentioned that status quo in Fulton County or in Lewiston. What is the connection from that time period, from the people in the antebellum period in Fulton County, the anti-government, the fear of activism, race relations, the fear of losing rural society or the world as they knew it? How does that connect to the philosophies that you see in rural areas today and the angst that you see, obviously, in those rural areas today, that their whole life can change and they fear that?
You want to be careful when you're drawing comparisons between past and present and saying, well, 2020 is a lot like it was in, 160 years ago. Of course, there's huge differences in American society now and then. On the other hand, I think that there's echoes in our society today of in much of Illinois, if you look at, especially, downstate and areas outside of Chicago and the suburbs, there's a lot of political conservatism in Illinois, downstate. And I think in a lot of rural America, there is an echo of this, suspicion of rapid change, of wishing to keep things the same or like they had been in the past. I think that there's the fear of government intruding on social relations and upending society is something that is dividing Americans today. And I think that you see echoes of that. One of the things I was interested to think about in the book was what happened to officers that William wrote about when he was writing home. And a lot of the officers that commanded him from Fulton County were Republicans. They tended to leave Fulton County after the war and to go to more urban areas. Indianapolis, Chicago, one went south and became part of Reconstruction, becoming took over a plantation in Louisiana, part of the northern effort to kind of reconstruct the South in a northern image. And so, that kind of political segregation that maybe we had seen a lot of recently in our political culture, perhaps has roots in this era of social political upheaval of the Civil War, and especially maybe in rural America. On the other hand, William comes back home. I think the debts that he owed before the war largely get forgotten about. He doesn't get hauled into court, so his military service seems to have paid off that way. He becomes a business owner. He buys a hotel and runs it until the 1880s when he passes away. So, I think there's also a message of getting back to the community, putting down roots, raising his family, making amends with people with whom he had bitter division, disagreements with during the war. So there is that. There's also, the sense that you can find common ground with people who have been your enemies. And so I think that's an important takeaway from this book, and perhaps, hopefully perhaps a message for us today in our society when I think it's really important to try to find common ground.
Yeah, one of the things that I know in those rural communities that's important is religion. And the economy can change, society can even change, but one of the things in those communities that is the bedrock that shouldn't change in their minds is their religious beliefs or the way that religion is viewed in society as a whole. So the secularism, I think, challenges them in a way, and maybe, I don't know if you saw that in the standards, but I think the secularism of more liberal philosophy is an affront to, like I said, the economy can change, society can change, but that shouldn't change. And if there's an attack on anything that causes these communities to, or, some similarities from the time period, it may be that.
It could be. As I said, I think American then was much more of a kind of Christian culture than it is today. Obviously, there's lots of Christians in America now. The standards don't, for me, it was very surprising. They don't write about their religious beliefs very often. They talk probably, and you can count on one hand how many times they talk about attending a church service, either at home or in the ranks. If they were denominationally, I think they probably were Methodists, which is a pretty, central evangelical kind of Christian movement that comes out of the Second Great Awakening. Yeah, I think that is probably an element of their conservatism, although I don't know that religion is something that identifies them. I don't think that they certainly don't believe that the Civil War is, an act of providence or an expression of God's wrath in the ways that maybe, that some of the clergy do during the war. Sometimes Lincoln talks about as being, when Lincoln writes about being, he confesses to not, being in charge of events, but, kind of following whatever God reveals is going to happen to the country. There's not that kind of philosophical or religious kind of rumination by the standards. They're very practical, kind of hardcore people. As I said, I think that the religious values of the time, generally speaking, other than certain kind of, radical abolitionists, religion is a conservative force in the United States at the time. And, you can probably locate the standards within that broad spectrum.
Well, thank you, Dr. Roberts. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Rob. It's really a pleasure. Thanks for the discussion. And certainly, if people get a chance to get a copy of the book, I'd love to, hope they enjoyed it. And if they have feedback, they can contact me over at Western Illinois University, and we can continue the conversation.
I would like to thank my guest once again, Dr. Timothy Roberts, for a very personal look at America's Civil War. And if you'd like to get his book, The Infernal War, The Civil War Letters of William and Jane Standard, just click on the link in the description below. It is a revealing and fascinating look at a couple's war correspondence during that conflict. The featured brew was Shock Top Belgian White from Anheuser-Busch. If you liked our conversation today, please share the episode with a friend and remember to subscribe to the podcast. Simply hit the subscribe button on the podcast directory that you use and get new episodes immediately after they are released. Subscribing is the only way to get new shows right away. The music that you listened to today was provided by the band Bones Fork, and they're producing new material as we speak, and we're looking forward to that. And as mentioned earlier, to the growing list of listeners from 40 countries and hundreds of cities across America, I would like to say thank you. I really, truly appreciate it. There are many great episodes on the way with discussions on a young JFK, which I'm really looking forward to, Alaric, and the political philosophy of the Founding Fathers. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
Yes, we'll rally round the flag, boys. We'll rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. We will rally from the hillside. We'll gather from the plain, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah. Down with the traitor and up with the star. While we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom.